Hi everyone, my name is Stephen Fredoso, and I'm an undergraduate assistant at the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. On behalf of David Solomon, the director of the center, I would like to welcome you to this week's installment of the Catholic Culture Series. Every fall since 2002, the center has sponsored a set of lectures focused on prominent figures in the Catholic literary tradition. The series sprang from the center's desire to expose Notre Dame undergraduates and the entire Notre Dame community to the richness of the Catholic literary heritage. Highlighting such major Catholic figures as Flannery O'Connor, G.K. Chesterton, Graham Greene, Walker Percy, and J.R.R. Tolkien, we at the Center hope to promote such writers both for the quality of their works and the uniquely Catholic dimension of their literary perspectives. This year, the series will focus on 4 Catholic satirists: Evelyn Waugh, Baron Corvo, Hilaire Belloc, and Oscar Wilde. Since classical times, satire has been a keen weapon of criticism used by rhetoricians in Western civilization. Some of the greatest satirists of modern times have been Catholics, yet from the Catholic perspective, there are also certain reservations about whether satire is truly a meaningful instrument in a dialogue of evangelization. This year's series seeks to contribute to this debate by examining the critique of modern society which these 4 men offered through their satire. Mark your calendars for 3 more Tuesdays after this lecture, October 7th, October 14th, and October 28th, when Father Marvin O'Connell, Joseph Pierce, and Father Charlie Gordon will join us in this room to continue the discussion. Tonight, we are privileged to welcome Dr. Ralph McInerny, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. McInerny holds degrees from St. Paul's Seminary, the University of Minnesota, and Laval University. He has taught at Notre Dame since 1955 and has been the Michael P. Grace Professor of Medieval Studies since 1978. He is the author of 24 scholarly books and many more scholarly essays. He has penned over 50 novels, including the well-known Father Dowling series. And he has served as the president of the American Catholic Philosophical Association, the Metaphysical Society of America, the American Maritain Association, and the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars. He is also a fellow at the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. His Gifford Lectures, delivered in Glasgow in 1999, were published under the title Characters in Search of Their Author. Tonight, he will give a lecture focusing on Baron Corvo. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ralph McInerny.
You going to help me turn this on? What are we going to put up?
Maybe like right here, maybe.
Right here?
You can just drop that in your pocket.
Okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for those remarks. I would do anything to be associated with the Center for Ethics and Culture and its esteemed director and founder, David Solomon. As many of you know, the center is one of the bright spots in the university at the present time. My topic is Baron Corvo, spoiled priest. Now, the concept of the Catholic author is a problematical one. Many writers who we would unhesitatingly call Catholic object to the label, not because they aren't Catholic, but because they fear their books will be seen as conveyors of dogma rather than entertainment. Perhaps the presence of a lot of Catholic lore in a story, Mass, confession, a priest or nun, would suffice. But Flannery O'Connor, surely a Catholic author, thought that such components were not the key. And she loved J.F. Powers, all of whose stories, save for a very few, deal with priests. So what would O'Connor think a Catholic writer was. Perhaps the way in which the deeds of characters are appraised, the stakes of life, the interpretation of good and evil. But that seems to cast too wide a net. One might tendentiously say that all fiction is Catholic or tries to be. The man I want to talk about tonight, Frederick Rolfe, 1860 to 1913, usually known by one of his pen names, Baron Corvo, would upset just about any account of the Catholic writer you could come up with. That he was obsessed with Catholicism is true, but it remains mysterious how that personal obsession can be said to modify his fiction. Baron Corvo is one of those writers who is far more intriguing as a person than anything that he wrote. In 1934, A.J.A. Symonds published A Quest for Corvo, an artful and fascinating presentation of a man then largely forgotten just 30 years after his death in Venice. It is not too much to say that Symonds' book began a renaissance in interest in Frederick Rolfe. And that book has defined discussion of Rolfe ever since. Symonds' portrait of a man whose life was a long declension into decadence has divided interpreters ever since. Saint or sinner, genius or perverted debauchee. Inevitably, discussions of Rolfe as an author become discussions of Rolfe as a man. In what follows, I will try to disentangle these threads, the biographical and the literary, but I'm going to end with a confession that this is an impossible task. Rolfe wrote 4 autobiographical works: Hadrian VII, Nicholas Crabbe, The Desire and Pursuit of the Whole, to which can be added, I think, The Weird of the Wanderer. Discussions of his life inevitably rely on these works, especially, perhaps, those studies which attempt to establish the biographical facts independently of their use in his fiction. W.H. Auden thought that Rolfe was a paranoid. Graham Greene called Hadrian VII a novel of genius. But he went on to contrast Baron Corvo with Francis Thompson, the author of The Hound of Heaven, contrasted them as a diabolical figure to that of a repentant sinner. It seems right to view Rolfe Corvo through the lens of the spiritual life. But that, of course, presents difficulties. Who can really judge another in this way? For it is the author, more than the books, that is then at issue. I will present Rolfe as a spoiled priest, taking the phrase from a novel by Canon Sheehan, which bears that title. It is, I think, an Irish phrase, but it might have been coined to designate Frederick Rolfe. The spoiled priest is a man who enters the seminary but leaves before ordination, and the rest of his life is haunted by that failure. A non-vocation becomes its own sort of vocation. Frederick Rolfe entered 2 seminaries, first St. Mary's at Oscott, and later the Scots College at Rome. He was a seminarian for perhaps a year and a half at most. He was certainly expelled from the latter seminary, the Scots College, and perhaps from the former as well. In the first, he received tonsure at St. Mary's at Oscott, not one of the holy orders, but a symbolic snipping of the hair that makes one a cleric rather than a layman. When he was shown to the door of the seminary, Corvo did not go willingly into the bright lights of the world. He persisted in the conviction that he had a vocation to the priesthood, a vocation which had been thwarted by his benighted superiors. Throughout his life, he nursed grudges against them, and they figure, scarcely disguised, in his most famous novel, Hadrian VII, in which his hero, George Arthur Rose, clearly himself, is improbably elected to the papacy. Now, Rolfe made a vow of celibacy for 20 years after being expelled from the Scots College. And it is a continuing question whether this vow was honored more in the breach than in the observance. He seems never to have let go of the hope of becoming a priest. Well, eventually he made it, if only in his own novel, Becoming Pope Hadrian VII. Fiction is the best revenge. Huh? Now, to call Rolfe an enigmatic figure makes understatement sound like shouting from the rooftops. For Pamela Hansford Johnson, who based a novel, The Unspeakable Skipton, on Rolfe, as for W.H. Auden, Rolfe was a mental case. But paranoia seems inadequate to explain the grudges he formed and kept throughout his life. I sometimes think that there must have been Irish blood in his veins. Huh? You know that Irish Alzheimer's has been described as forgetting everything except the grudges. Huh? The fact that Rolfe despised those he called Celts might seem to count against this. But remember what Dr. Johnson said of the Irish. They are an honest race. They never speak well of one another. One of Rolfe's most famous enmities was with the quintessential Englishman, Robert Hugh Benson, who appears in Rolfe's last novel as Bobugo Bonson. Benson had been impressed by Rolfe's Hadrian VII and formed a friendship and eventually proposed collaboration with its author. Benson himself was a prolific and highly successful author of novels about English recusants and of the incomparable Lord of the World. The two men did become friends, but like most of Rolfe's friendships, its initial warmth was but a prelude to an ultimate furious enmity. Like Rolfe, Benson was a convert. He was the youngest son of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Their proposed collaboration fell apart, and of course there are two accounts of why, that of Benson and that of Rolfe. Benson's case can be found in The Life of Robert Hugh Benson by Father Martindale. Almost everyone of late on this matter is sympathetic to Rolfe, but it is impossible to see the falling out in black and white terms, unless, of course, you are Frederick Rolfe. Benson did not live to read The Desire and Pursuit of the Whole, Rolfe's last novel. So in that sense, I suppose we could say Rolfe managed to get the final word. Now, Rolfe's life falls neatly into periods. The first, 1860 to 1890, we might call failed hope. Little is known of his early life. He was born in Cheapside in London, the son of a piano tuner, once a piano manufacturer. His family had been piano manufacturers. But things declined in the family, and his father was a piano tuner. From the age of 14, when he left school, scarcely educated himself, Rolfe held jobs in various schools over a period of some 10 years, and it was at Grantham that at 25 he became a Roman Catholic. The headmaster there, E.G. Hardy, later master of Jesus College at Oxford, took Rolfe in periodically over the years, giving him employment as the reader of his students' composition, because Hardy himself was going blind. Hardy is one of the few benefactors that Rolfe did not later malign, and his friendship and hospitality enabled Corvo to spend extended periods at Oxford. Raised an Anglican, Rolfe had a religious awakening as he entered adolescence. But some 10 years were to pass before he joined the Catholic Church, received by a Jesuit in Oxford, and then confirmed in London by Cardinal Manning. Rolfe explained his conversion by saying that he had become convinced that he was meant to be a priest, but he had come to doubt the validity of Anglican orders, so the next step was clear. He became a Catholic. Soon after, he entered the seminary at Oscott. Now, in those days, in his late 20s, he was considered a delayed vocation. And his attitude towards his fellow seminarians was, shall we say, condescending. Nor did he permit seminary discipline to limit his off-campus excursion. He had many interests in music and in art, and was far from being an ideal seminarian. At the end of a year, tonsured, he was told that his bishop had decided no longer to sponsor him. Now, his reaction to this can look like the first episode in a chain that became his life. He contested the decision. He demanded of the bishop, "Who advised you to let me go?" He interviewed the identified professors who had voted against him, although some denied it. And, of course, he berated the bishop finally. For all that, he was soon taken up by a Scottish bishop who sent him off to Rome. His stay in the Scots College was brief. His own explanation is that the bishop who had sponsored him did not, as promised, pay his fees and board and room, and he fell deeply into debt. For reasons to be touched on, I find that an implausible, or at least only partial, explanation of Rolfe's departure from the seminary. The way he went has become one of the set pieces in the story of his life. Told that he must go, Rolfe refused. And he took to his bed and would not get up. Finally, the rector, out of patience, ordered the bed with Rolfe in it to be carried into the street. Now, even an ardent champion of Rolfe's would suspect that there was something more involved here than unpaid bills. Among other charges against him that were mentioned were that he had wandered about Rome alone and without permission. And his reply was, "I never heard of that rule." Now, as told by Rolfe, this episode becomes a case study in malice and misunderstanding on the part of the rector, of course. Throughout his life, Rolfe despised that priest, Monsignor Campbell, and exacted revenge on him and Hadrian VII, when, in the guise of the Holy Father, Rolfe visits the Scots College and straightens it out. So there he was in Rome, out of bed and out of the seminary, broke, with no place to go. For a few days, a Dominican father, Mackey, a member of the Leonine Commission, paid his way at the Hotel Minerva. Rolfe's reliance on the kindness of strangers had begun. Soon he was the guest of the widowed Duchess of Sforza Cesarini, another English convert whose son Rolfe had met at Oscott. She took him in, and he lived in ease and luxury for months, a house guest, perhaps until November. It's sometimes speculated that it was at this time, living with the Duchess, whether seriously or not, he was dubbed Baron Corvo. These months are also the source of the tales Toto told me. So back to England he went. The period 1890 to 1891 could be called among Catholics. Rolfe was the most anti-Catholic of Catholic converts. He found the faith comfortable, he said, but he loathed the faithful. His attitude towards the clergy as potentially treacherous enemies grew from his seminary experience. But when he returned to the world, the laity too became objects of his distrust and disdain. To become a Catholic in England, when Rolfe did, was not as socially downward a move as once it had been. But in any case, it was not social snobbery that explained Rolfe's attitude to his co-religionists. The main fault of lay people was the main fault of the clergy. They appreciated his self-professed unique genius inadequately or not at all. Now, it's difficult to see whence came Rolfe's massive self-esteem. He had talents, certainly, several of them. He could draw, he could paint, he became a skillful photographer, and eventually he wrote. But it was not what he actually produced that fed his pride. His conviction of his own consummate excellence preceded any notable achievement on his part. Returned to England from Rome, he sought help from his co-religionists, still hopeful of finding a bishop to sponsor him. And he spent time in Christchurch, in Aberdeen, Scotland, and eventually ended in Holywell, in Wales, the site of St. Winifred's Well. He was styling himself during this period Baron Corvo, and he was living on an allowance from the Duchess. His writing at the time was fitful. Some journalism, the way the papists treat their converts, his first attack on his co-religionists, some poetry, but soon it was photography that fascinated him. Photography was somewhat a novelty at the time, and he experimented with color and found a patron who eventually let him go, upset with the expenses such patronage involved. Another betrayal. And he painted religious subjects, offering them to the local church. And there was the disturbing fact that he liked to swim nude and take nude pictures of boys. Also, there was the episode of the woman scorned. I won't go into that. It would be tedious to relate all the episodes of this period. Eventually, they were enshrined in his fiction. But a pattern emerges. A friendship is formed. His reliance on others is total. He goes into debt. There is an eviction from his quarters, eventually alienating his patron, who becomes an enemy. Throughout, he regularly threw himself on the bishop of Aberdeen, of Westminster. He had dealings with Cardinal Vaughan, Cardinal Manning's successor, invoking his own clerical status as a result of having been tonsured. The prolonged episode with Father Beauclerk at Holywell would provide a fair sample of the pattern. Rolfe painted banners to be used in the procession of St. Winifred, which show undeniable talent, but which became bones of bitter contention when payment for them was not forthcoming. This went on and on, accusation, and finally he received £50. The feud nonetheless continued, and it ended with Rolfe in the workhouse in Holywell, broke, bitter, fuming. 1899 to 1904 might be called a period author in London. The Yellow Book had accepted some of the tales Toto told me, and in London, Rolfe became attached to figures of fantasiacal aestheticism, Henry Harlan, Alfred Douglas, and others. It's interesting to see the people who were connected with the Yellow Book. Henry James was one, for example. Rolfe's history of the Borgias dates from this period, as well as many other proposals for historical essays and or historical fiction grounded on his vast knowledge of Catholic lore, Catholic history, particularly the Renaissance. Predictably, despite modest success, Rolfe became engrossed in arguments with publishers and agents, again thinking he had at last found what he was always looking for, the divine friend, the other half of his soul. Rolfe proposed a collaborative authorship with Sholto Douglas, as he had earlier with John Haddon in Holywell. These ended, predictably, I suppose, in acrimonious disputes. Rolfe did sell some of his writing, but the picture we have of him is of a shabby, haughty fellow badgering editors, speaking of his many exciting projects, portraying himself as the means to wealth and fame for editors and literary agents. Take me on and I'll make your day, this sort of thing. Most importantly of all, this was the period in which Hadrian VII was written, and it appeared in 1904 as by Fr. Rolfe, short for Frederick, but clearly meant to suggest Father Rolfe. 1904 to 1908, Benson and others. Hadrian did not do very well. And like all authors, Rolfe was convinced that this was due to the incompetence of his publisher. But what the novel undeniably did was usher in his friendship with Robert Hugh Benson. Benson contacted Rolfe, expressing his admiration for the novel. The correspondence continued. They got together. They went on a long walking tour, ending at the Benson ancestral home. Once more, the divine friend had been found. Benson suggested that they collaborate on the life of St. Thomas of Canterbury. Benson had also mentioned that Rolfe would be included in a community he hoped eventually to form. And Rolfe, of course, interpreted this as a promise that Benson was taking on perpetual responsibility for his economic well-being. Benson was a prolific writer and preacher with many projects. And his proposed collaboration with Rolfe soured when, on the advice of editors and others, Benson was persuaded that Rolfe's name could not appear on the title page. No need to imagine Rolfe's reaction to that. He tells us at vituperative length again and again the betrayal of Bobugo Bonson. From Benson, Rolfe turned to the Peary Gordons, who took him in, and with the son Harry Gordon, Rolfe formed the Order of Santissima Sophia, so-called lay order. Well, Harry liked to dress up, so they had garments and the like, and Rolfe was responsible for much of the ornate paraphernalia of the order. When the Gordons left for Italy, Rolfe was again homeless. In a fateful move, he assigned the profits from all his writings to a legal firm in return for a regular allowance. That these lawyers accepted Rolfe's estimate of the monetary value of his writings is surprising. But then again, they took out a life insurance policy on him, too. Eventually, this arrangement, too, became, in Rolfe's mind, one of perfidy and treachery. This period ends with Rolfe on his way to Venice as the guest of his friend Dawkins. So the last 5 years of his life, 1908, 1913, let us call it See Venice and Die. Now, Miriam Benkowitz, in her book on Corvo, has this to say: to know Frederick Rolfe, Baron Corvo, in Venice, is to know him at his most Corvine, most Rolfian. All that Rolfe was, all that he had become, in his more than 35 years of failure, disappointment, and contemptible dealings, hardened in Venice. Rolfe came to Venice for a visit as the guest of his friend Dawkins, and he never again saw home. Dawkins returned to England, but Rolfe remained. His bill at his hotel mounted. The proprietor became anxious. Rolfe, in the nick of time, made new friends, and he moved in with them. It was when his hostess asked him to read the novel on which Rolfe was working, The Desire and Pursuit of the Whole, which contained thinly veiled attacks on her English friends in Venice, styled Resident Aliens by Rolfe, that he was asked to leave her home. Now, it's sometimes suggested that from then on, Rolfe lived on the streets and canals of Venice, cold, starving, ashamed of his shabby clothes, intimate with young gondoliers, author of the infamous Venice letters, until finally death claimed him. Actually, he got another patron, an Anglican priest who provided him funds sufficient to buy a large gondola, to live in comfort, and of course, eventually to die. Thomas Mann's A Death in Venice is not a perfect template for Rolfe's final days. So that's the man, the writings. Hadrian VII is a good read. It's a fantasy in which all Rolfe's grievances are resolved. It opens with several repentant prelates, among them the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, visiting Rose, as the hero is called, visiting him in his London flat, agreeing that he has been most miserably and shamefully treated, and abjectly apologizing. The cardinal will be returning to Rome for the conclave. There, a deadlock ensues. The cardinal thinks of Rolfe, calls him to Rome, and with breathtaking implausibility, Rolfe George Arthur Rose is elected pope. All this is taken in stride by Rose as the logical upshot of the effort to placate him for all his troubles. Hadrian, as pope, brings all his old friends to Rome, creates them cardinal, alienates the old guard, becomes chummy with the Kaiser, and rearranges Europe. even involving Victor Emmanuel. He issues encyclicals that are more political than social, and social than religious. Old enemies from England and Scotland arrive in Rome and attempt to blackmail him. Meanwhile, he is getting rid, of course, the usual move in a Vatican novel, he's getting rid of the treasures of the Vatican. He's strolling around a no longer hostile Rome, a fantasy figure afoot. On one of these strolls, he is assassinated by the thwarted blackmailer. So died Hadrian VII, bishop, servant of the servants of God, and some say martyr. Pray for the repose of his soul. He was so tired. That's the ending of the novel. This, I tried to modulate my voice into a Corvian pit. This novel, remember, Hadrian VII, was written in England. So was Nicholas Crabbe, never published in Rolfe's lifetime. In it, he settled accounts with all his foes in the publishing world in London. The Weird of the Wanderer, published in 1912, also features Nicholas Crabbe. The pen name Baron Corvo is associated with none of these novels, none of these works. That had long since been dropped as a pseudonym. In The Weird, a book of time travel, papiria uncovered in the Middle East reveal that Nicholas Crabbe of London is the reincarnation of Odysseus. James Joyce would use the Odyssey to structure his novel about one day in Dublin. Rolfe earlier had gone a many times better by becoming Odysseus. Rolfe's last novel, The Desire and Pursuit of the Whole, was written in Venice and concerns Rolfe's life there. He is, of course, the hero. He's Nicholas Crabbe in every sense of the term. Triumphant over his enemies, the resident alien, united at last with the other half of his soul, the boy-girl Zilda, who becomes his slavish servant. His conception of love was clearly to have someone totally subservient to him and with no interest other than his comforts and the like. The novel has a happy, sentimental ending with Crabbe taking the boy-girl in his arms. No one could read Rolfe or about Rolfe without becoming aware early on of his homosexuality. His visits to Turkish baths when he could afford them, his unabashed fascination with the male body in photographs and drawings, lush descriptions in his fiction, are unmistakably revealing. Rolfe despised women. He called them bunchy. They had the great defect of not being men. Now, Zilda is boyish in body, save for the fact she is a girl. Their ultimate sexual union suggests the only way, perhaps, that Rolfe could be reconciled to the non-male. Hadrian, too, displays a penchant for the male form. The clues, and more than clues, are everywhere in Rolfe's life and writings. And then there are the so-called Venice letters, containing steamy passages of homosexual pornography, meant to entice his correspondent back to the fleshpots of Venice. Students of Rolfe are divided as to these letters, but the dispute is over whether or not they are reports of Rolfe's own experience. That doesn't seem to me to be the main question. Since that can scarcely be decided, it is best, I think, to concentrate on the fact that he wrote them. Whether or not they are personally confessional, they amount to putting his writing talent to a debased purpose. Given Rolfe's orientation, as we now say, His ejection from the seminaries can perhaps be seen in another light. Thus it is that Rolfe, the writer, the man, has become inextricably entangled with Rolfe, the man. He was his own favorite subject. His fiction is largely fantasies of revenge, the triumph over his enemies, and is so suffused with autobiography that it fails to transcend it. There is no doubt that it is Rolfe's life that has fascinated later generations far more than his fiction, insofar as the distinction can be made. And of course, the ultimate question, one that cannot be answered, is whether he was saved or damned. Some accept his self-evaluation as a martyr. Others, with Dantesque confidence, consign him to hell. He did receive the last sacraments in Venice when he was in the hospital with pneumonia. Now, there have been many novelists whose own lives provided them with the materials of their fiction. But fiction is not fanciful and vindictive autobiography. It is Frederick Rolfe's enigmatic life that will continue to fascinate. One is reminded of one of Belloc's epitaphs. When I am gone, may it be said that his sins were as scarlet, but his books were red. Thank you.
Now we have time for some questions. So if anyone would like to pose a question to Professor McInerny.
Dr. Solomon.
You remind me of, on all of us, how unattractive a character Rolfe really was. This series is supposed to be about wit. And one thing you didn't talk about was a feature of his writing. He was very funny, even especially in attacking.
Humorous,
humorous. Yes, he was witty, right? The Toto stories, for example, they have that kind of Edwardian
they're
wit.
a little kind of Aesop. I think they've been praised beyond their merit myself. Some of them are interesting, but most of them are fairly pedestrian, I think. And he wrote them, I think that's an opinion, of course, the right opinion. But but sometimes people, wax eloquent about these things, and, I would say read them. Most of them are contained in a volume called In His Own Image, which I've had for a long time, and I dip into it from time to time with pleasure, but I wouldn't say wow or anything like that. They're competent, I don't mean to put him down entirely, but there is a tendency, I think, to grant him more than he deserves, and his wit is a caustic, bitter wit. It's it's a function of his misanthropy, I think, but that can be funny.
Well, but say Wallace wit in a handful of dust or something like that. Surely,
That's irony, not wit.
I mean, in the weird of the wanderer. I mean, although I'm all on Vincent's side in that, it seems to me it is very funny. And
if you like broad. Bunso Babugo Bonson, I mean, that doesn't strike me as very shrewd. But no, I had no idea you dislike Baron Corvo. I don't dislike him, but I like him with moderation. Don't misunderstand me. I've spent untold hours of my life reading. When I was a young man here, Richard Sullivan, who was a professor of English, put me on to Simon's A Quest for Corvo. I'd never heard, of course, and he said, this is good. And he was one of those lovely people in the English department in those days. who taught writing and would put you on to things. For example, Ford Maddox Ford's memoir of Conrad, I owe my knowledge of that to Dick Sullivan. But he put me on to Corvo. That's a long time ago. And I've been reading him ever since with delight and pleasure, but with, reservations about his ranking.
Would you recommend, we have all these undergraduates in the... Would you recommend that they read Hadrian VII? I found that to be a terrific read.
That is the most readable, in one sense, of his novel. Probably the most accomplished is The Desire and Pursuit of the Whole. Got this unsavory undertow that you'd want to keep one hand in the holy water, maybe as you read it, but it's the most rounded of his. It has a happy ending.
Well, as a novelist yourself, how would you capture the strengths of Hadrian VII? Why is it that those of us who read it can't put it? It's a good read. What's so good about Baron Corvo?
Well, I think his strength is his weakness. His strength is that he wrote out of his own life. And much of his fiction is a scarcely restructured, if we can account, if we can give credence to efforts to find out the facts independently of the books, which is very difficult. In an aside, I indicated many people who want to find out the facts, the historical facts about Rolfe's life, are constantly citing the novels. Yeah? So it's a very complicated. But I think his defect is his strength. I mean, he's writing. The only thing he really was interested in was himself and what had happened to him. He is the navel of the universe as far as he's concerned. And we might think that of other writers, but not to this degree. And I think that's what diminishes. His fiction. It's what makes Hadrian VII not as satisfactory as it might have been, because we know the whole thing is a bill of particulars against all his enemies. Yeah? And it is factual, I think, as I suggested, that it's difficult to find anyone interested in Baron Corvo who's interested simply in the fiction independently. I mean, I don't know how you'd be interested in the fiction independently of his life, but, it's as a guide to knowing more about this weird figure that tends to draw people to his fiction. Now, that's a failure, it seems to me, in a novelist. If it's just a coded way of finding out about the author. Yeah. Yeah.
Put in a word for Hadrian VII. I agree with Dave. I think it's a good read, and I know a little bit about Baron Corvo when I read it, but not much. So I just read it as a novel, and I think a Catholic can see it as a satirical critique of the Church, especially the Vatican and that. And I know I've read that some people see in Hadrian a kind of foreshadowing of John the 23rd in some ways, that he kind of broke down some. For example, he went out and walked among the people. And he was for having a more intimate kind of papacy instead of being a sort of regal figure and so forth. And then other parts of it are ridiculous.
What would you say to this? If you had to read Hadrian VII to find out what the Catholic Church was all about, do you think you could find out?
I don't think you'd find that by reading Waugh or Green either. I mean, you see a little slice of it.
This is about the Pope. And in order to portray the Pope, you think you talk about what a Pope does. And he does almost nothing that has to do with the Church proper. He's writing letters to the English people, letters to the German people, and so forth, letters to the Italian people. They're all social, political. There's almost nothing that would have to do with the essential Christian vocation.
Right. Well, but it is a satire. I mean, it's not meant to be a realistic description of the present-day papacy, and I think a reader can.
Well, I was alarmed when you suggested that someone might liken him to John the 23rd.
No, I read that. That's not my. I read that readers have said that they see.
Big goosey goose and all that. read. I said that. I said it is a good read, but the limitations do come through as you reread it. It's just, as I've done many times. And that's, as someone has said, that's a mark of literature, that you reread it. So, in that sense, he has a claim on one. But that, I would tend to side with those who would say The Desire and Pursuit of the Whole is a more accomplished novel, written under much worse circumstances. But these things are up to a point subjective. But I think it would be very difficult for anyone to understand what a pope is and what he does by reading Hadrian. Of course, he was only pope for a year. It's like John Paul I, I suppose you could say, or not much more. One of the great redeeming things about Baron Corvo was he smoked like a chimney. When Hadrian VII was made into a play, it was advertised with a portrait of the main character sitting in the papal throne with a cigarette in his hand. It was wonderful. He'll go to heaven. Right? Yes, please. I'm going to come up because I don't hear her. I found out that in this room, there is one of those systems that if you have a digital hearing aid, you punch a button and you're restored to the condition of your youth. I'm not being menacing.
To what extent did he really embrace Catholicism?
Louder, please.
To what extent did he really embrace Catholicism based on his life and how he was so self-absorbed? Doesn't really seem like a very Christian mentality.
Yeah. Well, in how much did he really embrace Catholicism? Huh? It's it's noteworthy that his main motivation for becoming a Catholic and ceasing to be an Anglican was he wanted to be a priest. Yeah. But why did he want to be a priest? He said, "I want to offer masses for the dead." And his first mass as priest and pope was a Requiem Mass. Yeah? So, there comes through, that sense of a deep notion of what a priest does. And in one of the themes of Hadrian VII is that this man who is elected pope has no charity. He doesn't feel or understand what Christian love is. And one of the moves in the novel is when he gets a glimpse and intimation of that. Alas, the occasion is a young boy who turns out to be one of the sons of Victor Emmanuel. But it's a very cringy scene in which he talks about meeting this young lad and his reaction. But he does acknowledge that he has no sense of Christian charity, which would be, as we all would acknowledge, that's a pretty big lack, no sense at all. But that kind of self-knowledge is not to be disdained. So every once in a while you get a sense of a distance from himself that is more appealing than all of his imaginary victories over his erstwhile enemies and the like. Yeah. He was very devout from the time of his religious experience in the mid-teens to up to the time I'm not saying it ended there, that he became a Roman Catholic. The Garden of the Soul, for example, was one of his favorite spiritual reading. See, this is, I mentioned this is the danger of talking about Baron Corvo. You get into an area of assessing things where we have no right to go. He kind of forces you into this. How genuine a Catholic was he? How sincere was he in this real or alleged 20-year vow of celibacy after he left the seminary? And many people, in the light of those Venice letters, are saying, are these factual recountings of his own experience or whatever? And it goes back and forth. It goes back and forth. We're left with, I think, a totally enigmatic figure. And he prevents us from constructing a really likable version of himself, by what he puts before us in these, as I call them, the four autobiographical works. The tales Toto told me, these also have origin in his life. When he was living with the Duchess, he used to go off into the Alban Hills with a group of kids, and the initial tales Toto told me were supposed to be recounting what these kids said to him and so forth. Later on, there were gondoliers in Venice who were the source of the later one. What am I talking? Why am I babbling?
Would you connect just in respect to the series here? Would you say something about the relationship between Corvo and, say, Oscar Wilde? I mean, they seem to share this aestheticism. I mean, Baron Corvo, Robert Hugh Benson, and Oscar Wilde all share certain properties, a kind of distinct lack of interest in Christian charity, in all cases, we might say. A kind of aestheticism that went with that sort of Edwardian sensibility, a kind of tendency toward preferring male company, and on all cases. Do they form a school, do you think, or how do you think about that?
The Siècle, the Yellow Book sort of stands for that kind of decadent. There were a whole group of converts then that were, as we used to say in the Marine Corps, swishy. Huh? And there's a book called Roman Candles that we don't have in the library that concentrates on. But as for Wilde, there is nothing comparable in Corvo to the De Profundis of Oscar Wilde, written when he was in Reading jail, accused of what he was weak about. And he wrote this moving document, De Profundis, out of the depths, to the young fellow with whom he had been misbehaving, urging him to convert back to Christianity, to change his life. It's a moving document. Unfortunately, when he got out of jail, he reverted. He was a recidivist. He reverted to his old ways. But there are wonderful stories about Oscar Wilde's end. He was attended by a priest. But one of the stories about Wilde I like, when he's dying in this Paris hotel room, and he looks around and he says, "Either that wallpaper goes or I do." But there is a funny story with respect to Maritain. One of Maritain's spiritual directors told Jacques and Raïssa Maritain that he had attended Oscar Wilde at his deathbed in Paris. And yet, who's the guy that wrote The Big Life of Wilde before Peirce? Yeah. But there's no mention of this at all. And when you do read about the priest who was there, it's not the guy who was a spiritual director of the Maritain. So it's kind of, but what is clear is someone was there. Now, as I mentioned, some months, even a year before he died, Corvo came down with pneumonia and went into the hospital, and there he got the last sacraments. If you read The Desire and the Pursuit of the Whole, the self-descriptions of the spiritual life of Nicholas Crabbe can be very edifying. He goes to Mass every morning. He is very devout in at least observances and the like, but what connection it has with his predilections is rather difficult to see. But there it is. He's an enigma, I think. But again, it seems to me there you're pulled into an area, the internal forum, where we cannot go with another person and level some kind of ultimate judgment on him. So if you go just by the externals, you have just conflicting and contradictory, like all of us, I suppose. Huh? Yeah.
My upbringing was, I won't say depraved, because in this context that wouldn't make a lot of sense.
Did you yell at me?
Sorry. My upbringing was, I won't say depraved, because in this context that wouldn't make a lot of sense, but I was left to my own devices as a child and read virtually every Tom Clancy novel that had been published at that time, and I'm reminded of the Irish Catholic Jack Ryan being raised from a humble federal agent to President of the United States when the executive branch, the entire Congress, and the whole Supreme Court are wiped out in a terrorist strike, and he proceeds to reform the government and the world community in ways in line with that kind of thinking. And it's sad in a way because Clancy's novels, although perhaps not works of genius to begin with, were at least exciting, interesting studies in geopolitics and in character at first, but then they became these sort of self-gratifying fantasies like Hadrian VII. And I'm wondering, is there a relationship here? Could you have the one without the other? Could he have written a book of the quality that we're talking about, and yet had it not be the sort of acerbic, self-fulfilling fantasy that you just said?
Well, it's the emphasis on it and the centrality that I find in the novel in these political and geopolitical concerns on the part of Hadrian VII. They're not sort of on the margin of a more recognizable sense of what the church is all about. It's as if he's a world leader, you see, and he loves to meet with the Kaiser. It pains him that it takes a long time to get together with King Victor Emmanuel, the great foe of the papacy, certainly in the eyes of Pius IX and Leo XIII. Incidentally, Hadrian VII, I think, is portrayed as the immediate successor of Leo XIII. Right? So, it's that those concerns are always social and political concerns are always part of the church's mission, but the idea that they're the central thing, and the other things just seem to fade out of view, I think, in Hadrian VII. Plus, he's an anti-democrat. He's an aristocrat. He's a power politics kind of guy, realpolitik. It's all just shaping things up in a kind of authoritarian system that seems to be at the bottom of his thinking. That makes sense to you? Yeah. I wish it did to me. Okay. All right.
Let's give Professor McInerny a round. And please come back, same room, same time next week for Father Marvin O'Connell talking about Hilaire Belloc. Thank you.